Greg Stoker, it's a pleasure to have you here at Propaganda & Co. Studios. Thanks so much for taking the trip out here from Texas.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah.
I'd like to introduce you to my audience, so I'd like to know a little bit about you, your background, your story. If you could introduce us to yourself.
All right. Well, my name is Greg Stoker. My first job outside of high school was in the United States Army. I'm a former United States Army Ranger, which is a special operations unit within JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command. Started off as an assault team leader and then drifted towards the end of my contract into a more intelligence-oriented role, focusing on human intelligence collection, as in intelligence collected from human beings as opposed to radios, signal intelligence, image intelligence, so forth. And then, I got out, went to Columbia University, which has been a news point over the past month or two. In the general studies program, I went through Columbia University with a lot of other veterans because there's a separate program in Columbia University for people just coming out of high school and people coming from non-traditional backgrounds. So a lot of vets there. A lot of vets were IDF soldiers. So not surprised about what's going on at Columbia at all. But I went there, I studied anthropology and international relations, was going to go into the CIA because I had this childhood dream. I was going to do my 5 years and a few combat deployments and special operations, then go to an Ivy League, double major in the right subjects, and then go to Langley. And in the course of my studies, I realized, also during the course of my military career, realized, maybe imperialism is actually bad. Maybe colonialism is also bad for the colonizer. And a big part of that was watching Obama's drone strike policy unfold in real time. Watching, when I was exposed to the intelligence side of things, not just the direct action special operations side of things, kind of realized that we were hitting guys that just sometimes happen to be on the wrong guy's contact list, So, that was kind of disillusioning. And then that coupled with education and anthropology, studying colonialism in the British Raj, which existed for 200 years and only dissolved after World War II, and then picking up in Palestine, which was formed after, or Israel, excuse me. Well, we can call it what we want, but picking up at 1945 and 1947 with that colonial project. And those were kind of like my two focuses in some ways growing up in college. And then, just been floating around, and I'm now into geopolitical commentary.
So it sounds like you've had quite the life experience and career. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to do your job collecting intelligence from humans, as you described it? So what does that look like? As much as you can talk about, of course.
Well, okay, so how to begin? So in special operations, there's kind of a sort of, can be a sort of boys club, fast and loose with the rules. So I started off in the infantry, and I never actually went through any formal intelligence training. It's just over time, I went to language school, and I actually learned it, which, a lot of people in that community go to language school, but they don't learn it. They're just not interested into it. They just check the box. So that kind of impressed certain people. So I was afforded some opportunities, and I started off as a field interrogator, which is conducting field interrogations on high-value targets, identifying who that individual is, having very little to go off of, no image of the person, no proper name, just kind of looking for certain evidence that might be on them. If they have an established POL or pattern of life, that questioning of him or associates will confirm or deny, and then making a determination, and then taking that person off target to hand off to the dedicated interrogator. So that's how I got into it. And then after doing field interrogations, kind of transitioned into a more solid human intelligence collection role. So to kind of put it into other contexts, I was in a special operations unit, but everyone has a different role. So I was kind of at the end of my career, more of the intel guy.
Yeah.
So I was working in the Tactical Operations Command doing analysis during the day, and then I'd go out with the strike force at night for direct action raids and stuff like that.
Very interesting. So I take a lot of interest in this. I have respect for people that serve I think it's a brave thing to do. I think this concept of serving in the military to defend your nation is great. Obviously, we know how that can be abused, right? Yeah. But I'm always fascinated by the concept of serving and duty and discipline. And I think, what I'd like to hear from you, maybe as much as you can talk about, as you're willing to talk about, more of your experiences, I guess, on the ground. I think we were talking earlier and you mentioned that you had some combat experience. So what was that like?
What was that? Okay. Oh, where to begin on this
Like
one?
You've been in firefights, right?
Yeah.
So
it seems like in a different lifetime. I've had like 10 years of separation now since then. I don't know. I'd say when it comes to, first of all, you mentioned the whole duty and honor and stuff. I just needed a job, man. Like I was like talking to a lot of my friends. Like I just didn't want to be homeless, and I went into a special operations unit, or volunteered for one. And how the contracts work is like if you volunteer for it, you go to basic infantry training. You pass that, most people pass that. You go to AIT. If you pass, because I was in the Army, not the Marines. Marines and Navy are a completely different thing. And after that, you go to airborne school. That's where a lot of people drop out. Pass airborne school, then I went to the Rangers, so that's RASP, Ranger Assessment Selection Program. If you pass that, then you get to go to a Ranger Regiment. So if you have a contract, basically it just says, it guarantees that if you pass everything, you'll end up in that unit. So passed everything, and that's what I ended up doing. And the reason I volunteered for that and I wanted that contract, as opposed to doing something else like military intelligence, which was also another interest of mine. I just wanted to prove something to myself. I came, not a real unique story. Nobody who really goes into that kind of unit or wants to volunteer for that kind of service really had like the most stable home environment. That's kind of like what gets you through the really abusive aspects of a special operations selection process. Because, most guys are like, what's going on? And then, of course, the guys who pass are just like, more of the same. So I think we were kind of primed for that. And that's what attracted me to it. That's why I got through it. And that's why I did my contract in a unit like that. And as I said before, I had ambitions to go into civilian intelligence, like some sort of three-letter agency. And then I got disabused of that ambition when I started seeing what actually happened on the ground and learning from a scholastic tradition of post-colonial literature and theory. So
interesting. So talk to me a little bit about your experience, like prior to October 7th, and how you've skyrocketed now. You have this platform. So talk to me about your life prior to October 7th, and then how you essentially went viral. And now I think it's transformed your life. You have Colonial Outcast, the podcast, and people are very interested and glued to your profile because of your very rich and potent geopolitical analysis. And I think it's very helpful for people to understand what's happening, not only in Gaza and Palestine, but I think people are seeing that you have so much to offer about how to better understand what's happening in the world itself. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, so prior to October 7th, I was involved in humanitarian activities. I was raising money for certain NGO startups in India, and I had recently moved back to the United States from India the summer before October 7th kicked off. I didn't have a public profile. I had 150 followers, just a private account, just my friends on Instagram. Didn't even know what TikTok was really. But I think around October 10th, watching footage on Al Jazeera of 5 to 1,000 pound bombs. I don't think they were dropping 2,000 pound bombs on October 10th. That came later. Watching that and then looking at these pseudo military analysts or ex-military personnel like colonels and general officers like brigadier generals on CNN just absolutely lying about rules of engagement and what you can do. That really pissed me off because they were obviously lying, because I was in Afghanistan. My best friend was a fire control officer in Baghdad during the Iraq War. It's like, no, you cannot actually drop that ordinance in a population zone like that. It's against the rules of engagement. It's against the CDE, which is the casualty assessment report. Like how many civilian casualties can you have when you do a certain
justified
strike?
Target, right?
Justified target, whatever you want to call it. It was just this massive, unprecedented double standard that I'd never really experienced before or saw, and it was completely unconscionable. And the reason I felt so strongly about it is because I had prior knowledge about like the Palestinian cause and what happened. So prior to October 6th, or 7th, excuse me, there was really no possible way of a Palestinian state or Palestinian liberation from my perspective. I didn't see any movement for like over a decade. It was kind of buried intentionally so. I knew it was apartheid. Everybody knew it was apartheid. We know that Israel had violated more binding UN resolutions than anybody else. They're in gross violation of international humanitarian law, but it had always been like that. I think when I started to realize there was something wrong with the Israeli state and how there was a distance between the ideal presented in the propaganda that was pumped into the West and the actual reality of it, didn't come through like a human rights report. It came through military literature. So I was exposed to a 2006 report generated by the Combined Arms Center for Combat Studies out of Fort Leavenworth. It's a war college. So a lot of things happen in a war college. They conduct war games, which is like hypothetical exercises, and then they analyze the battle plans and do post-op operation autopsies on allies, and then make determinations about how they should change United States TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures based off of allies' performance stuff. So this is one of those post-op autopsy reports. And it was about the 2006 Lebanon War and about how the Israeli Defense Force got wiped by Hezbollah. And that's not what anybody heard. Everybody heard that in 2006, Israel went in, the UN said, hey, ceasefire, and then Israel was like, okay. And it's incidentally the first time Israel's really ever listened to the UN. Wonder why? Well, it turns out, according to U.S. Army literature, the official stuff accepted by and disseminated by the Pentagon was that they experienced a strategic defeat at the hands of Hezbollah. Because, I'm not going to get into the origins of the war. The salient point to what I'm talking about is they invaded this army that's supposed to be the most elite and powerful in the region, with an air force, with an artillery corps, with an armored corps, hundreds of thousands of reservists to pull on, bombed southern Lebanon. They rolled in with their tanks, and guys in tunnels using Soviet-era weapons defeated what was supposed to be the most powerful state actor in the entire region. Definitively defeated them. And one of the reasons why they defeated them is because Israel was doing the same thing they're doing now in Gaza, which is massive aerial bombardment. Carpet bombing doesn't work. Didn't work in Stalingrad. Didn't work in Vietnam. It's not going to work now. Didn't work in 2006. Doesn't work now. What else did they do that they haven't changed? Oh, yeah.
Why doesn't it work?
Well, because you just kill a bunch of civilians, essentially. Then you create a hellscape that you have to operate through. Like, one of their biggest operational advantages, the IDF, is they have tanks. So what happened to the Germans in Stalingrad? Well, tanks can go over just about anything, but what they can't go over is rubble, because rubble starts tearing tracks. Like, they'll start throwing tracks. They can't move anymore. So they crippled themselves. Israel did the same thing in Gaza. That's just one example. Carpet bombing also doesn't work because it turns the international community against you. And we'll go more into that when we start talking about Rafah, but it creates these massive diplomatic problems that your allies do not want to be associated with, because it curtails your global influence when you're associated with bad actors. So a lot of post-op propaganda went into, repairing Israel's image after the 2006 Lebanon war. So they did carpet bombings. They focused on mechanized actions with no infantry in support of their tanks. So what Hezbollah was doing was literally popping out of a tunnel that was covered by dirt. So like they open it up, some of the sand would fall through, put a ladder up, crawl up the ladder, anti-tank weapon, shoot the tank, go back down. And because they had no infantry support around their tanks, there was no one to intercept them or engage the guys popping out of holes to shoot the tanks. There was no infantry support of their mechanized units, and that's what we call combined arms, when infantry, armor, artillery all working together. So they're not advanced.
Why didn't they have infantry support?
Well, according to this post-op of the 2006 Lebanon War, and I'm directly quoting, and we can put it in the description of this video, we were caught unprepared, the 2006 Lebanon War, by the War College in Fort Leavenworth. They were, quote, the IDF and its officers were unprepared to fight a real war. The officer corps was undertrained. Everybody in the entire military was undertrained. It didn't know their jobs. And here's why. Because they're really a conscript army. Everybody brags about how, yeah, I served in the IDF. It's like, cool. You served for 2 years. Guess what you are after 2 years? You're still a dumbass specialist. You're not even a sergeant yet. Like, you still don't know how to do your job. So we're looking at these casualty reports coming out of Gaza, and there's 22-year-old majors, 25-year-old majors. So one of my best friends was a West Point artillery officer, did 2 tours in Iraq. He didn't make major until he was 34. So, like, they're too young and too emotionally undeveloped and intellectually undeveloped, and they don't have the experience for the positions they hold. And the same thing was true in 2006, and the same thing's true now.
Do you think even if they were prepared for this war with Hezbollah in 2006, that they would have sent their infantry in? Because they're casualty averse, right?
Very casualty averse.
Okay. Could you just briefly explain what that means to be casualty averse, and then let me know if you think that even if they were prepared, that they actually would have provided the tanks with infantry support?
Well, I hesitate to make conjectures about their internal communications because I don't really have access to them. But what it looks like from the outsider's perspective is, yes, they don't want to lose people. They don't want to lose men for whatever reason. I don't want to go into the sociology behind it. A lot of people have conjectures. It's about, like, their soldiers being so precious, they're not really expendable. And because they're so careful with their soldiers, they actually end up losing more than they would if they did things the way the rest of us did. I don't want to get into that, but I think one of the main things is that there is an image of their own invincibility within their own society. And what we've seen since the beginning of the Gaza war is they've been hiding their own casualties from their own people. So there was some conjecture that Russia was doing this at the onset of the Ukrainian war, because the war is unsustainable. They cannot fight a war of attrition. They don't have a lot of strategic depth, which means there is not a lot of standoff from the front lines and their industrial centers. So when a front opens up, like against Hezbollah, they can't absorb an offensive and make a counteroffensive and push the enemy back. They're kind of up against a wall without a lot of maneuvering room. All they have is like an air force and monetary support from the United States.
And that's because they don't have a lot of territory to work with?
They don't have a lot of territory to work with. They have a large military, regionally speaking, because everybody serves for 2 years, but it's not necessarily good or professional. They're not professional soldiers. There are some that are career, but the majority are reservists. So when we talk about, like, strategic depth and things like that, it's also economic. Their economy cannot absorb a war of attrition. It needs to be backed up month after month with foreign aid packages. We are seeing that play out in the Gaza war right now. So, yeah, they don't have a lot of room to maneuver, so to speak. So what they've relied on for the entirety of their military existence, like I'd say like since the 70s on, is what's called deterrence capacity. The idea that they've inundated us with over generations, that they are this lion of the Levant. They love the image of the lion, and they're the scariest, biggest apex predator in the region. And then the Mossad, it's omniscient. It knows everything. It knows what you had for breakfast. So that's what they've relied on for the most part, and a lot of people believed it. I referenced the 2006 War College paper because it kind of was eye-opening to me, and then I started looking more and more into it, and then I was like, yeah, that makes sense. They only serve for 2 years. They don't really have a lot of combat experience because most of what they do is they shoot artillery shells from behind their borders and do bombing sorties into Syria, and they're averse to infantry engagements, and they don't know how to protect their tanks and armored personnel carriers. So something that was so damaging about October 7th is all their deterrence capacity is gone. So they were supposed to be this omniscient intelligence apparatus. Didn't see it coming, or they did see it coming, but they were too arrogant to put any validity to it. Either way, whether they saw it coming or failed to act, it's still demonstrative that they are an ineffectual intelligence apparatus. And then their military, they were literally having to have their Apache helicopter pilots determine targets off of civilian WhatsApp groups, which is incredibly embarrassing from a military intelligence perspective. There was just no architecture. There's no infrastructure for any of it. They're caught completely unprepared, and now the blood's in the water. They're more vulnerable than anyone ever expected, and they're trying to regain their deterrence capacity, but they can't do it because in order to do that, they have to both defeat Hamas and then they have to defeat Hezbollah. And if they can't defeat Hamas, they definitely can't defeat Hezbollah, which is the most powerful non-state military actor in the world. And they have the fancy Cadillac stuff. Hamas is just using small arms like AK-47s and Yasin rockets, which, they've been shooting from 100 meters and still been destroying and getting engine kills on Merkavas and APCs, armored personnel carriers. So they're in a predicament when it comes to that, for sure. And before they went into Gaza, they made a bunch of bold claims. They said they would not leave Gaza until they defeated Hamas, which, according to their own military intelligence veterans, they can't do for another 3 years, which I believe is a completely optimistic estimate, to 5 years. So they don't have that amount of political capital. Their window of legitimacy is over, so they can't keep fighting this way for 3 years because obviously they'll become a pariah state. And they said they were going to get the hostages back, and that hasn't happened. They've actually made no effort, and it's demonstrable. In fact, they've undermined efforts to do it. So What we're seeing right now is kind of reminiscent of the Iraq War. We went in, no achievable, definable operational goals beyond overthrow Saddam. And then what to do? I don't know. Fight a holding action for like 10 years and hope for the best. So we're seeing that right now. And according to Hebrew media, this has been happening for months. There is a growing frustration in the upper echelon of the IDF command that they actually don't have any goals. So it's finally coming out what we already know. They don't have an exit strategy. They don't know how to implement tactical and operational plans. So everything we've seen is so disjointed, and then it's exemplified by this Rafah assault.
I think before we hop into Rafah, it's very interesting that you point out that Israel's deterrence has been shattered. Mm-hmm. I made a video about this, and it performed very well, but it was taken down, and so it's only available on X right now. Instagram removed it, YouTube removed it, and so I think a lot of people maybe not just because my video is not available, but because we're so far away from what happened on October 7th now, that people forget what actually happened. Mm-hmm. And as you said, what happened is Israel's deterrence was shattered. The veil of power was lifted. And it actually happened originally, as you pointed out, in 2006. But because it was covered up by mainstream media, and because maybe we didn't have, social media like we do today, we didn't witness a lot of the ways that Hezbollah was able to defeat and humiliate the Israelis in 2006. And now we're seeing Hamas do it. And I think that's what was I don't want to come across as praising October 7th because that's not good for the algorithm, but also, it was a violent act. But the way I've described it to provide some level of context is that it was a volcano waiting to erupt. It was a bubble waiting to burst. And on October 7th, it was a desperate act to bring attention back to the Palestinians and say, if you won't negotiate with us diplomatically for our rights, and if you're going to pretend as if we don't exist, because if you remember a couple days before, Netanyahu did what? He was at the United Nations holding up the sign, and Palestine is completely erased, and Israel has all of it, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And so the only way really to get the world's attention and to insist on their rights was to carry out this violent, destructive act, which, as we know, the atrocity propaganda was, all essentially fabricated. There was no mass rape. At least there's no evidence of it up until this date. There was no beheaded babies, no baked babies placed in ovens, all of these ridiculous lies. But it was an unfortunate event, but it kind of was inevitable. It was going to take place. And in the process of that, as you stated, they destroyed Israel's image. And I think that's something that, like you said, they're trying to fight very hard to recapture and regain, to show the world, hey, we are still strong. We are still powerful. And the example I used in the video I produced was when the slave uprising took place in Rome. When they put down the slave uprising, one of the things they did was crucify thousands of slaves. And so from Capua to Rome, like 100 miles, they had rows and rows and rows of bodies crucified so that anyone traveling down the road would see this is what happens when there's an uprising. So I think that's one of the things they're trying to show their Arab neighbors. Hey, if you get any ideas, like Lebanon, if Hezbollah wants to fight us, yeah, we had a tough time with them in 2006, but look what's happening to all the children of Gaza. We'll do that to your children.
That's a really good point. Actually, in January, I believe, is either January or February, Netanyahu said explicitly, if Hezbollah opens up a full-scale war, we will, quote, turn Beirut into Gaza, unquote. And I think it was, I'm not sure about this, but I think it was echoed by Defense Minister Yoav Gallant as well. So what's happening there? And we saw this in 2006, and why this is such a great reference point for what's happening right now. Because, again, Israel hasn't changed their doctrine or tactics or updated their military at all. Only the technology's changed a little bit. So at the end of the 2006 Lebanon war, they bombed a suburb of Beirut called Daya. And the thought there was to collectively punish civilians and make them hurt so badly that they would forever pressure Hezbollah to never engage with Israel or fight Israel again. So they built the Daya doctrine after that. And apparently they've disavowed it a few years ago. It's no longer implemented, but come on.
Yeah, just like with the Hannibal doctrine.
Yeah. It's like, okay, just because it doesn't exist on open source paper that you can access through the National Archives doesn't mean it's not being actually integrated into their military policy. So their entire doctrine is to put pressure on the civilians in order to get the associated militants to concede to Israeli demands, generally for surrender, which is always unrealistic because Israeli demands for surrender are unconditional surrender, which is why would we do that? We don't need to do that. We're actually winning. So the entire premise of their doctrine, you could make an easy argument, is actually collective punishment, which is actually a war crime. So what we're seeing in Gaza right now, in Rafah, because they've been threatening this Rafah assault for 3 months now. It's like we have a date. We're going to do it before Ramadan, and then we're going to do it after Ramadan. And they've, at the time of recording this episode, they've finally gone in. And one of the things that was happening, one of the diplomatic dynamics with the threatening the Rafah assault was to put the threat of civilian catastrophe as a lever to pressure Hamas into accepting a subpar ceasefire deal. So they tried it with famine, blocking aid into Gaza, turning Gaza into what is literally a medieval siege. There's no running water. There's bodies decomposing in the rubble. It's like shooting cadavers of cattle over the walls, so disease will inculcate. And
have you heard any reports of there being an outbreak of disease?
I mean, there's stuff floating around, but
because
a lot of the medical infrastructure is gone. A lot of Doctors Without Borders have withdrawn. There's, from my sources on the ground, there's 3 trauma surgeons left in northern Gaza. Testing facilities aren't really available. But yeah, there's diarrheal infections. There's staph, apparently. But in terms of numbers, you're not going to get numbers in a war zone.
Right, in a condition like this. That was one of the things that I read early on that kind of spooked me, because they were saying that, in the beginning, it's the bombs dropping, and then eventually there's this gradual famine. And, the less calories you take in, the less nutrients you have, the more susceptible you are to these diseases. And they were projecting that 6 to 7 months in, you're going to see an outbreak of disease that will end up taking the lives of a lot of people. And so I hope we never see that, but it seems like we're getting to the cusp of that, right, taking place.
It's only a matter of time. And again, this medieval-esque siege is meant to put pressure on Hamas to accept a ceasefire. So disease will happen, and people are still arguing that it's not a genocide. So the comments I get a lot generally refer to, like, if Israel wanted to genocide Gaza, they would have already done it. I was like, no, they wouldn't have. That's not how genocides work. First of all, there aren't enough bombs. They just don't have enough bombs to bomb everybody into oblivion. Also, they don't have enough bullets. This has always been the case. So if we were going to use the most well-known instance of genocide, which is the Reich during the Second World War, they sent SS brigades into Poland, Ukraine, and they were just shooting a bunch of people, mass graving everybody, but it had very marked psychological consequences on the soldiers. I mean, the soldiers, technically SS were paramilitary, but whatever. And they started drinking themselves to death. They started shooting their officers. They started shooting themselves. So you just actually can't do it. It doesn't matter how heavily indoctrinated the soldiers are. They're still humans. And so there actually needs to be a psychological degree of separation between the genocide that's happening and the people perpetrating it. So what you see is people generating throughout history circumstances where they won't kill them directly, but they will construct a mechanism by which they'll just die. So one of the things we see is dislocation, displacement, famine, manufactured famine, and with that comes disease because lack of shelter, lack of running water, lack of potable water, medicine. Sometimes you see labor camps of enslaved children, digging like minerals and stuff, which we're seeing in the Congo right now, and then forced displacement under threat of violence, like the Trail of Tears of the indigenous Americans. So technically, the American colonial people weren't killing the indigenous tribesmen. They were just like forcing them to walk, and sometimes, they'd fall out of formation, have a seat by the side of the road, fall asleep, and die. Well, they're technically not killing them. So how I interpret a lot of these displacements, actually, these arbitrary things, I was like, okay, everybody needs to move because we're going to start attacking this place in Gaza right now. And it's Rafah, but as the Rafah assault began, they're also saying they're still going to go into northern Gaza again and then middle Gaza because their, quote, work is not done. It's a form of mass exhaustion, fatigue, and it's kind of like, looks to me like an internalized new Trail of Tears where you just have to keep moving from place of no shelter. It's a death march. So that's why it's a genocide.
That's disgusting. That's absolutely disgusting.
So
all of it's disgusting, but to get to that level of detail, I think in carrying out a genocide.
Oh, well, you have to be myopically obsessed in order to do it. They are obsessed with this. So yeah, I mean, there are military planners who have put a lot of thought into this. So one of the big things that they're counting on is despair. Like, so you have the drones flying, buzzing around, can't sleep. That's just one thing that would drive anybody crazy. We have instances of them blaring, screaming baby sounds out of loudspeakers, which is some CIA black site stuff to like drive people insane. So yeah, they're trying to manufacture despair, a lack of the will to live. So and if that doesn't kill you, well, maybe you'll accept voluntary emigration to get out of Gaza. So yeah, all of this is intentional and it's manufactured. And it's meant to put pressure on the civilians, and hopefully Hamas will just surrender unconditionally, which they won't because they don't have to.
So, Rafah, you've described it as most likely going to be a failure. So talk to me. We've talked a little bit about why most of this has already been an operational failure, but it seems like they've only partially invaded Rafah. Israel is threatening to invade the rest of Rafah. And from what I'm hearing, and you could tell me if this is true, or at least your opinion on it, is that they are threatening the invasion of Rafah to get a better deal.
Yeah.
To force Hamas to accept a subpar deal, as you've described it. If is that true, and if so, why are they going to fail when they finally do go all in on Rafah?
Well, first of all, we need to back up and talk about the ceasefire deal as it existed when Hamas accepted it. About 24 hours, I'd say, prior to the assault on Rafah, the initiation of operations. So it was a 3-stage ceasefire deal. I don't have the points in front of me, but the first, it was meant to take place over about 42 days. And each stage had a requisite number of hostages that would be exchanged. First stage was a temporary cessation of hostilities. Israel withdraws out of Gaza. Humanitarian aid is restored. Hostages will be exchanged. Second phase, working towards a temporary ceasefire. By the way, Al Jazeera put the details of this. I don't have it in front of me, but and then the third stage was permanent ceasefire, exchange of living of remains of casualties, hostages, and hostages on the Palestinian side. You know, because the last phase is generally going to be the exchange of remains of people who died in captivity. So another part of that was a agreement for a reconstruction plan for Gaza. And that's one side note I want to make. American taxpayers, you paid for the bombs, and you're going to have to pay to rebuild what the bombs blew up. So just another thing to be excited about. And so that was a ceasefire deal. Hamas accepted it. It was brokered through Qatar and Egypt. And usually when those two actors are involved, it's usually done through the brokerage of the CIA. So you have William Burns, CIA director, who's actually more of a diplomat than a spy master. He spent most of his career dealing with Russia in a diplomatic capacity. So he's a negotiator. He's trying to get this done. And that signals that the Biden administration actually wants this to end for a lot of complicated reasons about global influence and global security that we can get into later. But despite the tightrope that the Biden administration's trying to walk, appeasing paymasters that he's beholden to and trying to actually do his job as the president, which is the foremost diplomat in America, well, things are falling flat. But anyways, Hamas accepted it because they knew that Israel was going to probably attack Rafah no matter what. And it was a PR victory for them, and they had nothing to lose by accepting it. And honestly, the deal was favorable to Hamas. It gave them everything they wanted. And then shortly before that, the Israeli Department of State said that Hamas had changed the proposals. There was a big language gap, but then U.S. officials refuted that, saying, no, there's only a few minor details and tweaking of language, but the bones, the skeleton of the agreement was the same. Anyways, Israel didn't like that. They also want to keep the war going for their own reasons, so they invaded. So yes, it's a lever, it's a pressure point to get the deal more favorable to them, and it also, you can't understand Israeli military policy without internalizing and accepting the fact that, or the truth that what they really want is the Gaza Strip devoid of Palestinians. And then after that's done, they want the West Bank. So none of their operational strategies or tactics make sense unless you view them through that lens. And I don't know, I feel like I internalized that a while ago, which is why I've been somewhat successful in my analysis and predictions. And because that's demonstrably what they're doing. So in Rafah, they have multiple objectives, I think. I don't think they really have clear, defined, achievable objectives, but it's like, get a better deal, displace as many people as possible, and control that border crossing because, you know, in the Rafah border crossing, the Philadelphia corridor, which is the code name for the strip of land in southern Gaza between Gaza and the Sinai, there's a lot of tunnels under there that Hamas uses for smuggling to get food, weapons, equipment in. So they're trying to find those tunnels ostensibly, but the IDF has proven to be remarkably ineffective at finding these tunnel systems. So what they're doing there, I don't know. It's causing a big geopolitical problem, though, especially for Egypt, because it's in violation of the 1979 Camp David Accords. Egypt's own population is getting very angry because the Egyptian government is... we know they're at least tacitly allowing IDF troops to be on their border, which is not supposed to happen. And so people are saying like Sisi's complicit in that as well. But in terms of what the IDF can accomplish in Rafah, well, they don't have enough men to clear through it. Clearing through 1.4 million displaced people living in tents with infantrymen is not possible. So they came up like 2 weeks ago with a plan to set up checkpoints, sorting checkpoints that will separate the women and children from the men, and the men stay behind in Rafah. What could possibly go wrong with that? So I don't think they've implemented that yet. So what we're seeing right now is random AI targeted bombing, and limited mechanized infantry patrols and raids into eastern Rafah. Now they're going to push further into central Rafah, and they are encountering heavier resistance than they expected, actually.
So is it correct to view Israel's attack on the Gaza Strip as a whole in two ways? One, the fake objective, I call it fake at least, which is presented to the world, which is we want our hostages back, we want Hamas to surrender, and we want to prevent this attack from ever taking place again, what they experienced on October 7th. That's what they told the world, right? But it sounds like the real objective, as you've alluded to, is actually to ethnically cleanse Gaza, to thin the population, and make it completely unlivable. So for me, and I don't want to make people feel hopeless, I don't want people to feel like the Israelis are victorious or succeeding, but in my view, they kind of are. They've obliterated Gaza. Universities are destroyed, mosques are destroyed, hospitals are destroyed, homes are destroyed, roads are destroyed. Gaza is completely destroyed. Living in Gaza is currently not possible, and it will not be possible, they say, until 2040, potentially, like to return to what it was like prior to October 7th, prior to all of this chaos. So in a sense, they've succeeded in making it unlivable. And I've spoken to some Palestinians who are from Gaza, and they have family members, and they've lost 30, 40, 50, 100 members of their family. And they've told me, some of the family members they've spoken to have said, I will never leave Gaza. But many of them have said, if I get the opportunity to leave, I will, because I don't want to stay here with my children. How can I keep my children here in Gaza, whether we might reconstruct it and it might take 17 years to do so? So does that sound, as dark as that sounds, as almost hopeless and pessimistic as that sounds, does that seem correct to you? That in that sense, Israel is succeeding in achieving their goal? Yeah,
but it's not a long-term strategic goal. It's like a short-term gain that will end up biting them in the ass later on. Because what's happened now, because of their brutality in Gaza, again, the notion of a Palestinian state has come back on the table, and people were discussing. It was like, hey, the two-state solution might not actually be feasible. It's kind of dumb for a lot of different reasons, and so this idea of like, wait, isn't Israel supposed to be a democracy? And Israel's being BDS'd, boycotts are starting to happen. All the markers for it becoming a pariah state are starting to finally clink into place, slowly. But these things do take time. So yeah, Gaza's screwed. Even a massive reconstruction effort will take time. People are going to get displaced. They're going to accept voluntary immigration. Does that mean they'll be able to ethnically cleanse it? Probably not. Genocides, ethnic cleansings really have never. There are very few instances historically where they've ever been successful. Doesn't stop people from trying. But when we talk about like what the future holds, we're in a lot of very unprecedented territory. This has literally never happened before. We've never given such free reign as the United States government has to one of its allies. We haven't seen this amount of belligerence from a state actor in full view of the world before. We have the advent of social media has been completely wild in terms of upsetting the democratization of the news media. Certain power structures that were reliant on that media are being completely challenged and validated. So we don't really know what it's going to look like, but we can look to historical trends, and the closest one is South Africa. And what Israel's doing right now seems a little bit more malevolent than what was even happening in South Africa right now. So a lot of political theorists have said like 20 years it might be dismantled. Some people say 10. Some people say it's just going to keep existing. So there's not like a consensus on what the future will look like. So we're just taking it one step at a time, moving the ball forward 1 yard at a time. And it begins with a ceasefire deal, pressuring for that, and then making reparations and hopefully dismantling an ideology that has led to genocide.
Yeah, very interesting point, and well said, I think. So short-term success, I guess, in thinning out the population of Gaza and inflicting collective punishment, but
it's going to boomerang back on them,
yeah,
and it's going to boomerang back on the United States. And one of the things because of this that's happening is the United States, which relies on it for its empire on the global South. We rely on the global South for our cheap labor and cheap resources and our lifestyle on the global South, and we're losing the global South because of this. You have countries in Africa like Niger and others within that region saying, get out, get your army air bases out and leave. We don't want you anymore. We're losing influence in the region to Russia, to China, to Iran. This is completely eroding the West's credibility, and it's going to have long-term strategic impacts for us for decades. So, yay, good job, Biden, for not reeling in the dogs. So I want to talk more about that. Before we talk about this rising influence of Russia, Iran, China, BRICS, multipolar, etc., let's talk about the nature of resistance. So we've seen Hamas's tactics change, I think, since the beginning of October 7th. Or when I say change, I mean adapt, right, to their conditions. So talk to me about like the way they've been resisting, the way they've been carrying out defensive maneuvers and attacks on the IDF, and how it's adapted, I guess, over time, over 6-7 months. I think many people are surprised. How have they survived this long, right? So can you talk to us about what kind of tactics they're using, what kind of weapons and tools they're using, and how they've adapted? Well, before we begin, I think we should define like at least one aspect of military science with regards to fourth generation warfare. So for the generations of warfare are basically just categories to help people conceptualize what war looks like at different given times. So first generation is like swords, spears, shields. Second generation is like gunpowder, cannons, mounted horsemen with guns, flint musket rifles, people still using swords sometimes, Napoleonic Wars. Third generation is like World War II, Korea, state versus state actors with like air forces, artillery. This is very reductive, but fourth generation warfare looks like asymmetrical warfare. So it's a state like the United States versus a non-state actor. So the state actor in this context is Israel. The non-state actor is the various resistance fronts in Gaza and to a lot lesser extent the West Bank. And Hezbollah is also a non-state actor that's involved, and you could argue that the Houthis are also a non-state actor. So it's fourth generation warfare. So one of the basic premises is if you are the state actor in occupation, like we were in Afghanistan, you have to win militarily, and all the resistance has to do, the insurgents have to do, is just to not lose. Because eventually, if they just don't lose, you will run out of political capital. You'll run out of money for a war of attrition. Because mobilizing state militaries with air forces and artillery and like all these moving parts, turns out it's really expensive. So you have an economic drain. Operating in an insurgency that uses tunnels, guys don't really eat as much food. They're using small arms. They're not using jet fuel. They're not having these massive logistical networks that stretch from the American continent to halfway around the world. It's a lot more sustainable, and you're harder to target. Fourth generation warfare will always favor the non-state actor in the long run. So what's happening right now is Hamas just doesn't have to lose, and one of the basic premises is Hamas, the resistance cannot defeat the IDF militarily, because the IDF has what? Fifth generation fighter bombers, tanks, an entire fleet of Reaper and Predator drones in the sky at all times, just scanning with satellites, looking for anyone with a gun. And the response time to shoot the person with the gun out in the open is, I'm not sure what the response time is, but it's not long. So, and they have 500,000 reservists to call on. So how can a group of 40,000 orphans, I say orphans, they're not all orphans, but a lot of them are from the Israel's mowing the grass operations. How can they defeat the IDF militarily? They can't. It's just not possible. But they can defeat them politically. So they're going for the political victory in everything they do. So eventually, it's happening sooner rather than later. They're running out of political capital, they're running out of time, and they're running out of legitimacy. And again, circling back, their doctrine is collective punishment of civilians. This only makes them more illegitimate in the long run. And so people are like, why doesn't Hamas just surrender? It's like, they don't need to surrender. When have resistance movements ever placed civilian considerations in front of military considerations? It's never happened. If you look at the French resistance in Paris to Nazi occupations, what would the French underground do? They would assassinate a couple Nazi officers in a bar. And then what would the Nazis do the next day? They would line up a bunch of random civilians against the wall and shoot them. Who was prosecuted at Nuremberg? Was it the French underground? No. So, yeah, they're not going to kowtow towards collective punishment because there's really not a precedent for that really working that well. So, and Hamas is demonstrably winning. They're winning politically. They're still able to continue combat operations for years. According to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which is one of our intelligence aggregators, they've only taken like 20 to 30% casualties as of like 2 months ago. Not only that, a lot of those casualties are expected to recover, and they're actively recruiting now. The resistance fronts are, because people that were on the fence before seeing Israeli aggression, well, they're not on the fence anymore.
Are you talking about recruiting within Gaza?
Mm-hmm.
So they're not. Wow.
Yeah, because Israel's managed to create a whole new acronym: Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. I'm sure they don't have an entire new generation of recruits coming. So again, they can keep this as a multi-generational struggle. Israel can't. They're out of money. They're out of bombs. They're out of political capital.
So you know this, right? Mm-hmm. I have to imagine the Israelis understand this. So going into this, they have to have imagined that they're being baited and that they're entering a situation that's untenable. So given that they understand what's at stake, what were they thinking going in? What did they think? How did they think that they could win in this type of asymmetric warfare?
Well, first of all, it's probably a number of factors. They believed in their own invincibility, invulnerability, and general badassness that they'd be able to do this. You saw the same kind of arrogance that they had towards the Palestinians that U.S. generals had towards the Viet Cong. Watching footage from like 1965 when the Vietnam was still breaking out, there's this one general, I can't reference it, sorry, but I know it exists. It was just this one general from Texas. He's just like, this war ain't going to take a long time. Anyone who has to hide in a hole is not a worthy enemy. It's like, okay.
Was that Curtis LeMay?
I think it might be. Are you familiar with that quote?
I've never heard that quote.
Okay.
No. But I remember Curtis LeMay he was pushing hard to go harder in Vietnam. So
there was a lot of mistaken military projections that happened on the side of the U.S. During the Vietnam War. But yeah, they didn't learn the lessons of history, like, hey, don't turn Gaza into Stalingrad. Hey, don't underestimate the tunnel networks. And not only did they believe that they were invincible, perhaps at least certain elements believed in their own power, just like we did going into Vietnam, riding the high off World War II and performing somewhat well in Korea, but some people might disagree with that. They also definitely saw it as an opportunity to, like, finally, let's pump out the atrocity propaganda. Let's talk about rapes. Let's talk about beheaded babies, and we'll just bomb the hell out of Gaza. This is our chance. We've been waiting for this for decades, because you can't just do a genocide. Like, you have to, and still be part of the global community. You have to manufacture circumstances under which it can happen, legitimately. So, it was a perfect opportunity for them to enact that as well. So it was a number of factors.
Right. So it sounds like hubris and arrogance, thinking that they could do what has historically been proven to be impossible.
Yeah.
And then secondly, just tempted by this desire they've had for so long. Let's finally take the Gaza Strip for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, you had Ben Gvir saying wild crap way before October 7th about Gaza. So,
Yeah, I recall during the Trump administration when they had the Abraham Accords, one of the things they were trying to negotiate was a deal that established a Palestinian state in the Sinai, and they were going to make the Palestinian state like a labor state where the Israelis could export some, logistics or cheap manufacturing into the Sinai, where these cheap Palestinian laborers living in the desert would essentially finally get their own state. They'd leave Gaza, they'd leave Palestine, they'd live in the Sinai, and they would just serve as cheap labor right off the border for the Israelis.
It's such an absurd plan. It's like, first of all, how do you get the Egyptian government to agree to it? More importantly, how do you get the Bedouin tribes in the Sinai to agree to it? They've been fighting a low-intensity counterinsurgency against Egypt for a minute now, too. So just a ridiculous plan. Some of these guys are crazy.
Right.
And completely detached from reality. So unfortunately, they determine Israeli policy, which is why it's been so irrational and why it's been so hard to predict. It's like living with an abusive partner. It's like, oh, did I make the tuna casserole wrong? Like, what's he gonna do next? Yeah.
I wasn't planning to ask you this, but based on how we just ended the last segment, I want to ask you about the psychology of Israeli society, how narcissistic they are collectively. Have you thought about this at all? How do you perceive their society as a whole? I know obviously there's room for individuals to think differently, but as a society, this ability they have to gaslight, to self-victimize, and to be completely it's not that they're oblivious, but to almost deliberately ignore the suffering of the Palestinians and view themselves as completely justified and in the right, and refusing to acknowledge the consequences of their actions and how they are complicit in bringing this situation upon themselves, and how it's not morally or justifiable or sustainable.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this. I've talked to a couple of anthropologists about this, people with backgrounds in sociology, some psychologists. There's different views or beliefs, but I think the core of it is we're dealing with a multi-generational form of indoctrination. So if you look at the demographics and the political beliefs of Israeli society, it's actually the younger generations that are the most far right and fascist. Like the most like liberal, or what we can call like, I don't even know what liberal means anymore, man. But I'd say the most left would be the older generations. So it's you can make an assertion, and you can argue an assertion that over time, every reiteration of this indoctrination through each generation, it becomes more and more intense and more extreme. Their anger, the amount of anger and fear that is generated, it has its core in Zionism, which basically says that if you don't have this place to live, the world is going to try and kill you. That's reductive, but I mean that's at the core of it. So what we're seeing right now is the government freaking out. You have Israeli pundits going on Piers Morgan and all these talk shows and just getting more and more unhinged because they're getting more and more scared. They don't understand what's going on. They don't understand why this project is failing. And anger is always a secondary emotion. It covers up other emotions that we'd rather not feel, like shame, embarrassment, fear. I think there's a lot of fear going on. Like, why is the world turning on us? We're the victims. They honestly believe that. A lot of these guys honestly believe that they're the victims. And I see and interpret a lot of what's happening as they honestly don't understand why the world isn't with them. So I think that's actually what's going on. Like there's this massive disconnect between their reality and the reality of the rest of the world.
And unfortunately, it seems like there's no negotiating with that. There's no talking to that, no convincing. The only way is either through military force or sanctions, right? Obviously, we don't want to see a massive military confrontation between Israel and anyone because that's destructive for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like the only way really is to shake and wake Israeli society up to snap out of this thinking, the psychology that they have, and force them to acknowledge reality. And I think the way to do that is like economic punishment, sanctions, and that's starting to happen, as you alluded to earlier, and we'll talk more about.
Yeah, that takes time, though. It takes a long time. So one thing I bring up when I talk about like dismantling Zionism and why I don't really have the highest hope for it happening within our lifetime. My grandmother was German. She grew up in Germany, came to America, had some really problematic beliefs. Surprise, right? So we're seeing what's happening in Germany right now. Denazification never really happened. Yeah, like a lot of people technically aren't Nazis anymore, but they're still fascist. They're still fash AF. They believe in the state. They supplement personal identity and autonomy to what's best for the whole. I'm not going to waste time trying to define what fascism is here. It's beyond the scope of this discussion. But yeah, nobody fascist like my people, and denazification never happened. And another far right ideology that's predicated on victimization and justifies defensive expansionism doesn't and believes in its own racial supremacy might take a while to dismantle. So there's a lot of corollaries between the Zionist ideation and what led to National Socialism. The belief in a homeland, the belief that there was existential threats that were trying to destroy them, and the only way to be safe was to defensively expand. And we see that with Israel. It's like, oh, we don't want to have to occupy the Golan Heights, but we're going to have to invade, and then we're going to have to stay there for our own protection and security. And that's what happened, in the 40s, man, in the 30s. So we look towards the historical precedences to make predictions for the future. It's like, I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. But that being said, regardless of how they feel, and far-right ministers feel, they will have to accept political realities. They will have to accept that if they keep going down this path, they're going to face more sanctions, they're going to be ostracized from the global community, and that will have long-term repercussions for their nation.
Can we just bring the mic a little below your mouth?
Okay.
Yeah, that's better. Good. It still captured all the audio. I just want to make that change. Do you feel like they're overcompensating? And I feel like they're obsessed with strength and power. Do you feel like they're overcompensating for their collective history of weakness?
I mean, that's definitely one of the sociological things going on. They express and communicate through the logic of force. And you can see it if you look at all of these Hezbollah Twitter posts. They'll say things like, we're no longer the weak Jew anymore, or the Jews fight back now,
or Jews with I'm not a Jew with trembling knees.
Yeah,
that's something that you're seeing a lot. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So they have this kind of settler colonial masculinity complex, that we saw with westward expansionism in America. It's like the cowboy stuff, right? The strong pioneer man, fights the Redskins and, makes the land civilized because, we love life and culture, and they're the barbaric stuff. It's old colonial BS. It's settler, what we can call settler colonial masculinity, taming the land and the savages therein too. So it's not just trauma from the Holocaust. There's also that dynamic going on as well, I would say. So
let's talk about the axis of resistance. So Iran, their proxies, Hezbollah, to some extent the Houthis, which technically is a proxy of Iran, but apparently they operate more autonomously than, let's say, Hezbollah. But yeah, let's talk about the axis of resistance and their role. We've talked a lot already about Hezbollah, but maybe we can comment briefly on the Houthis, and also talking about Iran recently, their exchange directly with Israel, which was the first time we've seen that before, and how that may have shifted or changed the dynamics in the Middle East moving forward in a way that we've never seen before. Right.
So when we talk about Iran and when we hear about Iran, you and I view it through the lens of Americans. And our interpretation of Iran is viewed through a carefully constructed narrative of what Iran is, what its capabilities are, what it wants. So one of the things I grew up hearing was Iran wants a nuclear program so they can destroy Israel. I grew up as a white guy in Texas, so you heard a bunch of stuff that's not actually correct about the world. They have a nuclear doctrine currently that's not trying to expand, apparently. But putting all that aside, there is this constructed narrative about what I like to call the Iranian octopus. Like, it has its tentacles all throughout the Levant, into the Gulf with the Houthis, and they control all these proxies. And there is this idea that Iran exercises the same amount of control and influence over all these proxies the same way. And we, newsflash, man, the U.S. and the West has our own militant proxies in the Middle East. They're just not talked about in our media. So, but if you tune into Iranian media, there's all sorts of groups that are attributed to be Western proxies. One of, I think it was it late October or early November? There was all the catastrophes are bleeding together at this point now that we're like 7 months in, but there was a car bombing at a funeral.
Yeah, that was December, I believe.
That was in December, and yeah, it was attributed to U.S. affiliated proxies. That's what, I mean, I do believe that it's possible. I don't think the Islamic State claimed responsibility for that one, or if it was attributed to that. But
there's always dispute over what they actually take credit for. You know?
Well, they take credit for everything, so it's hard.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, so we have our own proxies in the region, and to a greater or lesser degree, we also have influence and control over them. But it's not this unilateral across the board. They control Hezbollah, they control Kataib Hezbollah, they control in Iraq, they control the Houthis the same way, and then a bunch of other groups, the Islamic resistance and the Levant. It's just not like that. That's just not how it works. So sometimes they will tacitly consent to an operation that a group wants to conduct. They will shut down other operations. They're like, no, you're not doing that. And then sometimes, groups won't even inform them of what's going on. And the same thing happens with our proxies. It's messy. It's what we call a shadow war. And what's happening is we're using these proxy groups, both the U.S. and its allies, against Iran and Iran, vice versa, to fight for influence in the region, to compete for influence in the region. And hopefully, using these things as kind of conceptual bargaining chips, we hope to win concessions that will transform or transmute into diplomatic realities. So, the Houthis, they seem to be acting more independently than perhaps Hezbollah does, but Hezbollah, you could argue, is becoming more independent as they're now more associated and embedded in the Lebanese government as a political governing entity. It's kind of hard to assess based off of open source information. But
it's very interesting what's happening with the Houthis. They haven't been talking about them very much, and it seems like they've just completely abandoned the Red Sea. Like, you know what? We're not using that route anymore.
Well, yeah, one of the things that was interesting about the Houthis was how they handled it, the media attention they were getting, right? So the Houthis began as an entity in Yemen that was not very popular with a group, I wouldn't say a majority, but a lot of Yemeni people, because of how they took over Sana'a, and they have a very problematic history, especially within the region. But they've used this to kind of repair their image, being seen as like champions of the Ummah and other things like that, operating independently of Iran to a greater or lesser degree. And they've been targeting Israeli shipping. They've been very deliberate in their targeting, very professional about it. They've been using anti-ship missiles. They're the first people to actually start using anti-ship missiles. And they've engaged the U.S. Navy. And the U.S. Navy has parked 3 destroyers with their Aegis missile defense systems around there, and they're still getting through that. And the U.S. is responding, but they're not really wanting to escalate, because to escalate against the Houthis in Yemen, who have been bombed by the Saudis since the early aughts, they know how to. They know it's not going to be effective against them, so they have to put boots on the ground. And we don't want another forever war. So a lot of what's going on between the Houthis and the U.S. Navy is performative. Like, they'll hit a shipping container, or not a shipping container, a container ship, and then the U.S. the U.S. Navy will have like 10 targets that they've pre-designated if the Houthis want to shoot another ship. And then they'll shoot those 10 targets. And those 10 targets may be intentionally empty warehouses. They may be decoy missile sites that the Houthis have set up. And the U.S. Navy will know they're decoy missile sites. And so there's this game going on to satisfy the public that something's being done about shipping, even though the United States can't really do anything about it without becoming engaged in another forever war. So a lot of it's performative. And the media's not really paying attention to it because nothing's changing. It's kind of like a stalemate. And also, it's embarrassing to certain actors in the United States. So the media, they want media attention off it.
When you say it's performative, is it still having the intended effect, though? They're still affecting shipping, though, correct?
Yes, they are still affecting shipping. Absolutely. When I say it was performative, let me clarify. It's kind of performative on the U.S. from the U.S. perspective. Like Joe Biden said himself, he wasn't eating an ice cream cone at the time, but he was stepping into a car a few months ago. He was being asked by a journalist, are the strikes in Yemen having any effect on the Houthis? And Biden said, no, they're not. Are you going to keep doing them? Yes, we are. So that's what I mean.
A rare moment of honesty.
Like, yeah. I mean, Biden's so bad about saying the quiet part out loud. So, yeah, it's completely performance. And a lot of what's been happening between Iran, the United States, and Israel in terms of their strikes have been performance.
So let's talk about Iran now.
Okay.
The strike that they had on Israel. So the Israelis, they've been having a tit for tat for decades now. Israelis have been killing, Iranian scientists. Working in Iran,
It's
working on the
nuts,
nuclear program, which they actually have some pretty, to their credit, they have some pretty cool assassinations. Like, they had this automated machine gun that was like in a car, and they like wirelessly remoted it and controlled it and took out an Iranian scientist. But they've been bombing the Syrian airport and different targets in Syria to prevent Iran providing Hezbollah weapons in Lebanon through Syria. And they have targeted many Iranian generals and commanders and diplomats. And the most recent escalation was the attack on the embassy in Damascus. And they killed 5 or 6 high-level generals and commanders. And according to Scott Ritter, these were really high-level guys. That apparently these guys were training and planning the logistics for the Houthis, for Hezbollah, and apparently reportedly for Hamas. I don't know where Scott Ritter gets his information from, but that's what he says. And Scott Ritter has criticized Iran. He said it's kind of foolish to have some high-level guys like that all meeting in one place. They should have been more aware of the possibility of Israel being aware of that meeting and then taking out such high-level guys in one strike. But at any rate, this led to Iran being forced to respond. Let's talk about that response and what it means.
First of all, about the meeting, I think they were assuming that Israel wouldn't be foolish enough to set the precedent of blowing up embassies.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Okay, I was talking about this on my podcast right after the strike happened, and we're like, okay, so there was intelligence officers, military officers, and political officers meeting in an embassy. Oh my God, that never happens. It was a particularly juicy target, but still, it sets a dangerous precedent. And I guess they were trying to leverage not wanting to set that precedent on the global stage for embassies now being viable military targets. Putting that to the side, talking about the Iranian response to what most people consider to be an act of war. Blowing up an embassy is an attack on Iranian sovereignty, and that's generally not great. So before that, I think we need to go back to 3 U.S. service members being killed in a Jordanian airbase by drone strikes.
And this was a couple of months prior.
So a suicide drone reportedly shot by Iranian proxies in Iraq got through the air defense systems because of some apparent miscommunication or glitch or targeting error and impacted on the base, whether it was Syria or Jordan. I'm not going to get into, but three service members died and others were wounded. And the U.S. vowed retaliation. But the thing is, U.S. does not want to escalate in the region. Iran doesn't really either. So I don't think Iran actually wanted that strike to happen. I think they're kind of like, oh my God, that our proxies are getting out of control. So the U.S. took like 5 days. Really telegraphed, CENTCOM did, U.S. Central Command, telegraphing what they were going to do. It's like, we're going to respond to Iran. We're going to hit them hard. You don't get to kill U.S. service members and get away with it. That's what like idiotic military analysts or like not spokespeople. Who's John Spencer, head of the Warfare Institute? I don't know if you've ever seen his presence on Twitter.
Mm-mm.
Oh, but okay. Anyways, he gets paid trips to Israel, and he's like, you don't get to hit American assets and get away scot-free. And the U.S. was like, yeah, you're right. You don't get to do that. Hey, Iran, we're going to hit you. Hey, 3 days pass. Hey, we're going to blow the crap out of your stuff. And then they were like, oh no, we're going to wait 2 more days. We have to hold for weather because we're more precise when there aren't clouds in the sky. Like, we don't have the most high-tech stuff ever. So it's like, okay. And then we finally struck different warehouses and empty targets in the Levant with 85 really expensive airstrikes. And it was a smoke and light show, and nothing really happened. We hit the targets. It was published in the media. 24 hours later, new news cycle goes away. De-escalation achieved. So we don't want to escalate in the region. Israel hit the embassy. That was a problem. It was an attack on Iranian sovereignty. Iran had to respond. So what did they do? They also telegraphed their attack. It was like, we're going to do this at a time and place of our choosing. And eventually they shot a bunch of suicide drones and medium-range intercontinental ballistic missiles at Israel. So it was their old stuff. It wasn't their fancy new Cadillac stuff. I think I've said in this interview the word Cadillac more times than I have in the past year. I don't know why I keep using it.
No, I've only heard you say it maybe 2 or 3 times.
Okay. But okay, that's still more than the past year. But anyway, so they shot these waves of this stuff, and the vaunted Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow 2, they're all air defense systems that operate at different levels within the atmosphere, and some got through. They were precision hits on military targets. They got through not only Israel's air defense system, but this was with coordination with the Jordanians. They were getting targeting data out of like Saudi Arabia. They were using U.S. aircraft. UK fighters were launching out of Cyprus. So it took like three nuclear powers targeting data from the Gulf states and a bunch of other stuff to stop a fraction of Iran's arsenal from impacting on Israeli soil. And it still got through, and they hit the targets that they wanted to, which were military targets, which were empty. They're like tarmacs and empty warehouses in an air base in the Nakab Desert, for instance. And it was kind of like, see what we can do with just a fraction of this and our old stuff. So I think my interpretation of that is that it was a success. It allowed Israel to save face. It allowed their propaganda machine to go into overtime, saying, like, look at our turrets. Like, we have the bestest air defense system ever. I don't know if you saw like how ridiculous that entire Hezbollah cycle was.
Yeah, we took out 99.9% of all the projectiles. Like that's the kind of thing that they were saying.
Yeah, well, it's like we didn't take out 99.9%, and it was their old stuff, and it was a fraction of their arsenal. So Israel said, we can't have to respond to this act of aggression. So what happened? They launched some drones into Isfahan, and they were intercepted by air defense systems. And then Israel, again, their Hezbollah cycle went into overdrive, saying like, "Yeah, look at the skies above Isfahan. This is what happens when you mess with us." But it's all part of a de-escalation game, because there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. The U.S. didn't want to escalate. They don't want to escalate. And one of the reasons why we don't is because, like, first of all, we can't afford a war with Iran, and also because of Iran's massive arsenal with their hypersonic missiles. If they can hit Israel, they can delete all of our military assets, all of our bases in Iraq off the map. They can hit oil sites that are important for our energy security. They can hit Qatar, like massive air bases in Qatar and the Gulf, and we don't have the air defense capacity to defend against that. So, and also it's an election year for Biden. He doesn't. Do we want to go back into what people denigratingly refer to as the sandbox? Do we want another forever war in the sandbox? People are freaking sick of it. So.
And it would be a third war, right? There's Russia, Ukraine, there's Gaza, and then there's potentially Iran. And Biden came in saying, Donald Trump is the threat to the world. He's going to bring World War III. And then he becomes president, and there's 3 wars, and all of them teeter on the edge of World War III. Yeah, not a good look in an election year.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's another point of political pressure. And that's what Iran is leveraging, too. Like, they're taking all this into consideration. It's like, how much pressure can we apply on Israel and the United States to end the war in Gaza? Because us being anti-genocide makes us look good, even though we're doing some shady stuff in Balochistan, you know. But it helps like repair our image a little bit. And so they're doing this brinksmanship. It's like, how much can we push them without causing this situation to escalate, because nobody wants it to. So what we're seeing is a game of, both smoke and lights, performative, and also there's some behind the scenes pressure and escalation management and brinksmanship happening.
So let me ask you this, because I was convinced for a while that Israel wanted escalation, that Israel was desperate to escalate the war to kind of, first of all, take advantage of the fact that there's an opportunity to destroy the only real competitor and threat they have in the region, which is Iran. The only threat to their hegemony, I think, in the region is Iran in the long term.
Right.
So before you comment on that, one, they wanted to take advantage of a potential opportunity to drag the U.S. to fight that war for them. And 2, they wanted to save themselves from ultimately what is probably going to be a loss to the resistance factions in Gaza and in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah. So, but it seems like after Iran was able to demonstrate their ability, that all of a sudden Israel cooled on their efforts to try and drag the U.S. in. So do you see it that way? Does Israel actually want to escalate with Iran and drag the U.S. to fight that war for them? Or is Israel legitimately, like, I guess, was that never really a thing? Or did they learn their lesson and like, okay, maybe we shouldn't try to escalate with Iran, because actually they do have some powerful capabilities?
Well, it's not just Iran. They can't do it with Hezbollah. So there's this article translated into English. Anyone can look it up. It's called Fire and Blood off the Israeli tech magazine Calculist. I can give you references for that after this. There was an entire think tank experiment. I think it was at the Reichman Institute. You can reference it in the article, which is like one of the few private universities in Israel. And they got together over 100 IDF officers, and they played a war game, and they did an assessment about what a full-scale war against Hezbollah would look like. Well, the sheer arsenal of rockets that Hezbollah has, it's estimated that within 3 days, Hezbollah, if they really opened up, could overwhelm and exhaust the stockpiles of Iron Dome interceptions within 3 days. And then they'll start hitting Tel Aviv. They'd hit electricity plants. They'd hit water processing centers. And it would just be a massive freaking mess. So they want to open up a front with Hezbollah, maybe, but they can't do that without U.S. boots on the ground. So even before they were trying to get the U.S. involved in an Iranian beef, they were trying to get us involved in late December when they hit. I forget what his name was. the first Hamas
Yeah, they hit a Hamas high-ranking official
in Beirut.
In
Beirut, and that was their first extraterritorial visible strike they did, and that was to antagonize Hezbollah into going up an escalation ladder. But Hezbollah again is locked in escalation management, and they're not doing anything that would provoke the U.S. getting involved. So they continue to apply military pressure through indirect fires and rocket attacks, but they're not escalating. So they tried to get the U.S. involved in that, didn't work. And if the U.S. is not going to get involved with Hezbollah, they're definitely not going to get involved with Iran. In fact, when Iran said that they were going to do a retaliatory attack, the U.S. said essentially, "Hey, we're not getting involved. We're not going to assist in a reprisal." So,
let me ask you about BRICS and the multipolar transition that we're experiencing right now. For those who don't know, the multipolar transition is essentially this idea that since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, the U.S. has been the sole or the unipolar power, the superpower with complete hegemony on Earth, and they've been running the show. But with the rise of China, the resurrection of Russia, and the decline of the U.S. empire, we have gone from one top dog to now the U.S. essentially being 1A, China closing on being 1B, and then Russia there as a third power. And so essentially you have multi-polar powers on Earth, and they're all vying for influence. And this transition causes a lot of tension. And this transition has made its way to the Middle East, where China and Russia are rising in influence. Can you talk to us about BRICS, what BRICS is, and how this manifests itself in the Middle East, and how this kind of relates to Israel?
Yeah, so BRICS is definitely complicated to conceptualize. I know when I was studying international relations, it kind of took me a while to kind of really understand what BRICS was. It's kind of like anytime you get involved in any sort of academic theory, it kind of takes time to wrap your head around. But the most simple way of explaining it, it's a geopolitical bloc. It's a group of countries working together in some way. So before we get into that, BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now it's South Africa. Iran's now part of it, Egypt, Ethiopia. Iran just became a member, I think, this year, right? In
January. Saudi Arabia as well.
Saudi Arabia. So it's basically a multilateral organization or league of countries. It was originally envisioned to highlight investment opportunities and to work together on the basis of equality and equanimity between nations, mutually supporting each other. So one of the big projects of BRICS is China's Belt and Road Initiative, which China is kind of spearheading. It's this idea and the plan to implement global infrastructure, which will benefit everybody. So it's kind of the idea that the rising tide lifts all ships. So. And the reason why BRICS is important to a lot of people is because they see it as a challenge to Western hegemony, and the rival, you could say the rival geopolitical bloc would be the G7. G7 is a conglomeration of Western nations and advanced economies, according to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that have, kind of determined global policy for a lot of reasons. The G7 believes in plurality and liberalism and all these great things that sound good on paper, but they've also created, structures of power through military force and debt colonialism, like in the IMF and the World Bank, to control other countries' economies. And it's very problematic. And it exemplifies Western hegemony. And then again, BRICS is seen as a challenge to that can break this cycle of unipolarity that you mentioned, rooted in the West, exemplified by the United States, which controls the West, obviously, as the most powerful empire. It's in decline, but it still has a lot of inertia behind it. Mm-hmm. And that's the important importance of BRICS. De-dollarization, because the United States controls the world through the dollar. So BRICS, through equanimity, working with other countries, hopes to create a rival system of currency that can be viable on the global stage that will give other people an opportunity to escape the dollar, which and the power of the dollar and the influence of the dollar, which Gaddafi was trying to do, but then, whoops, something happened. No idea what happened there in Libya. So, it's important. And the one thing that America fears most is losing the global South. I brought this up earlier. BRICS is a kind of a way out, an opportunity for countries in the global South to get out from under the thumb of Western hegemony, debt colonialism from the IMF, which basically comes in saying, hey, do you need to prop up a failing economy? Well, let me lend you some money. And if you piss us off, we might call in your loans. This is very reductive. We don't have time to get into it. But it offers countries another way of doing this. And China's Belt and Road is kind of seen as a rival to some of these systems from the West. It's like, okay, we will help you build up your infrastructure, your industrial capacity, and give us something on the back end. And it looks different. Some would argue that it's still another form of colonialism, but it's more palatable to a lot of people, and that's why and a lot of nations, which is why China and Russia, the Sino-Russian influence, now Iranian influence, is growing in places like Central Africa and the Middle East, because people are getting sick of Western hegemony, and especially since October 7th, Western hypocrisy is just on display for all the world to see.
When I was in Kenya, I was doing some work there. I was filming for a nonprofit. One of the roads I drove on, and this was like a newly developed road, and we went to some really remote areas in Kenya where the only existing roads were roads developed by the British when they colonized portions of Kenya over 120 years ago. So the roads were terrible. But this one highway we took was nice and smooth and recently developed. And there's a big sign, and it says, built by China. Mm-hmm. And that's the Belt and Road Initiative. And like you said, the idea is to develop the infrastructure for trade, because China has a lot of goods to export, and the West is beginning to say, hey, let's reduce our relationship or dependency on Chinese manufacturing and exports. So China needs new customers, and they can't do business with you if you don't have the infrastructure. So they're starting to develop that. How does that play into, or does it play in at all in the Middle East and potentially what's happening with Israel?
Absolutely. I don't think you can understand contemporary global politics without considering the Belt and Road Initiative and BRICS. And the reason why it's complicated and it takes time to wrap your head around is just because of a nation like India is part of BRICS doesn't mean it's not working with G7 nations economically. So India, part of BRICS. It's also turning against China. And so even though they're both part of the same geopolitical bloc, so the United States is kind of propping up Modi's government and the BJP, even though they're getting real fascist, real quick, and real Islamophobic. I mean, they have been for the past 20 years, but it's getting really bad. But they are courting India more because they're a economic power in Asia, and they offer some, and they're kind of cold towards China. So what they're trying to do is, at the beginning, when you talked about Netanyahu shortly before October 7th, holding up that sign at the UN, well, he was referring to the New Silk Road, right? The Mumbai to Europe trade pipeline.
Right.
So what that is, it's this Western project. It's not really even off the drawing board. Basically, there will be a pipeline of goods, the New Silk Road, from Mumbai, ship it across the sea to
the UAE, right?
The UAE and Saudi Arabia, put it on trains, take it through the Jordan, and ship out of Israel from Haifa to Cyprus to Europe. And that will compete with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative to reinvigorate the old Silk Road, which existed for thousands of years, going from China through the stands into Iran, through Turkey and into Europe. So One of the big differences is that the Chinese Silk Road Belt and Road Initiative is way more advanced, and they've been working on it for what since like 2000, like the mid 2000s before. And this new Silk Road that the West is trying to implement is not really even off the drawing board. But Israel's really important for that project because they're our strategic foothold in the region. They are where all the goods will ship out of from the Middle East into Europe. So that's a massive consideration for the United States and Europe's unconditional support with Israel. They want a normalization deal to happen between Israel and the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE to happen so they can make this thing, this new trade pipeline work politically.
And I guess the idea is it can, one, further cement Israel's position in the Middle East, that if they can improve relations and economically connect each other and make them dependent upon one another, that they can keep Israel safe in the region so that the colonial project works in the long term.
And also, if they can normalize between Israel and the Gulf states, they will hedge against Iranian influences into Saudi Arabia and the Emirates as well.
And this is their way of reducing, I guess, India's relationship with China. Like, okay, you have the Belt and Road Initiative, but you don't need to necessarily handle a lot of your exports through the Belt and Road. Why don't you just go through this new Silk Road? And that, in a way, sort of undermines BRICS.
It doesn't really India's
or at least compete with it.
Yeah, but India's also part of BRICS. This is where it gets sticky too. So, yeah, but India will be getting out on top no matter what, I think, right now. So,
okay. So let's transition now to the hot topic, the university protests.
Yeah.
Let's start with Columbia, and then let's talk about UT Austin and what you guys did over there and what's happening in general around the country. A real revolution taking place on campuses. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, it really sparked up. It's going to die down a little bit now that the semester's over, but it'll kick back up eventually. So what happened with Columbia? Well, Columbia has always kind of has a tradition of starting these things. You know, it was big during the civil rights, during Vietnam, during South African apartheid. I was going there to Columbia University during BLM, so there was a lot going on as well. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I went through with a lot of IDF veterans. What you have to understand is that Columbia University is such a hotspot of controversy because it is literally in the Zionist capital of the planet outside of Tel Aviv, which is the Upper West Side Manhattan. That is where all the hardcore Zionists live. It's either Upper West Side of Manhattan, which, if you're not familiar with American geography, Manhattan is a part of New York City. It's one of the boroughs. So in the Upper East Side, and that's the capital of the most entrenched Zionists on the planet. The administration, very hardcore pro-Israel, always has been, probably always will be. If you're an IDF veteran, and you apply to Columbia University, you'll probably just get in. It's like that. So if you ever want to go to an Ivy League school, just find a way to get into the IDF, and then boom, you're in. So not the brightest tools in the shed, but they still get to go to the Ivy Leagues. Anyways, I wasn't surprised by the backlash that the students endured from the administration. The Ivy Leagues and academia in general has been kind of compromised by special interest groups that are inherently pro-Israel. Same with the publishing industry, same with the art world. All of these elitist liberal institutions are always going to be pro-Israel. But yeah, the thing that's significant about it is that Columbia University is an Ivy League. Whether or not you think like that's impressive or not, the optics are, when you see like Harvard and Yale doing something, like people take more notice, especially internationally, because people don't know about what University of Texas is, or like people don't know what USF is, but everybody has heard of Yale, Harvard, and Columbia. Mm-hmm. So internationally, it's important because people will be like, oh, that's like the Oxford of, America. Right. So It started there, and it gained a lot of traction because the NYPD is going to do NYPD things, be unnecessarily brutal. How the administrations have handled this has been completely compromised, and the reporting from the New York Times, from the media, has been completely at odds with the reality on the ground. And it's a great focal point for all of this because you can look at history to student protests, and they're always significant. They were symbolically important during women's suffrage, civil rights. Vietnam backlash was when it really got heated. University campuses became like the spearhead for like spreading the word about the Vietnam backlash, for educating people, people who had never been to college, older people from other generations. And one of the most seminal moments of anti-war sentiment happened at Kent State, where the National Guard were called in, killed 4 students, and that's when the turning point really shifted against the war in Vietnam. Yeah, it went on for like another 7 years, but that's when it was like, why are we doing this? When people started to actually ask questions. So there's a long history of that. The students occupied Hamilton Hall, which is the faculty hall, which was traditionally the traditional point of occupation during the Vietnam backlash. They went in, broke all the frigging windows. I don't think I completed the word, so I think we're good.
No, we're good.
During apartheid in South Africa, they did the same thing. There's just a very long history of doing that. So it's kind of absurd to me when people are like, what's all this property destruction about? It's like, well, it's nothing new. And
it's also nothing in comparison to the genocide they're trying to raise awareness about. I want to comment a little bit on divestment. So I have some experience with divestment because I was a member of Students for Justice in Palestine, and we at USF organized one of the largest BDS movements in the country, which I think a lot of people don't really know, which is not surprising because these movements are oftentimes, these actions are like disconnected. A lot of people don't know about them, but also 10 years ago when we were organizing it, people weren't really paying attention, right? Not in the way that they are now. So the first thing I want people to understand is like, what is divestment? So like every university has an investment portfolio, and the investment portfolio is made up of, some of it is tuition from students, some of it is donations made by wealthy people, and they do this for clout, they do this because they actually care, whatever. And sometimes the state, like in the state of Florida, they will match a donation. So if a wealthy person gives $1 million to the USF endowment or for their investment portfolio, the state of Florida will match it. So 1 million becomes 2 million. And that's how they're able to develop an investment portfolio of several $100 million. In the case of Columbia and Harvard, it's like in the billions. I think Harvard's like a $40 or $50 billion investment portfolio. And then just like on the stock market, they invest in different hedge funds and investment groups, and then they invest in specific companies. At Columbia, like you said, they divested from South African apartheid, fossil fuels recently, and I think even private prisons.
Yeah.
So at USF, we asked for something similar. I'm not like against the concept of fossil fuels, right? We need energy, but USF invests in BP, and BP has proven itself to be really irresponsible in the way that they extract energy, right, in the form of fossil fuels from the earth. Off the coast of Florida and Texas, they had one of the largest oil spills ever, like 10 years ago, right?
And a side note about BP, it's inextricably tied to Israel now because BP was, in November, was awarded the exploration rights to the Gaza Marine Basin.
Right, the natural gas right off the coast of Gaza. So USF, our university, refused to divest from fossil fuels. They refused to divest from private prisons, and they refused, obviously, to divest from Israel and the corporations complicit in sustaining the occupation of Palestine. Many of these corporations are American corporations, like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman. They make the bombs. Caterpillar makes the militarized bulldozers, which are destroying the streets and the homes of Gaza and in the West Bank. And HP, classic example, they create the biometric identification systems, basically scan your fingerprint right at an Israeli checkpoint, and they'll determine, oh, you're a Palestinian, scan your fingerprint, you're on this registry, okay, we're not going to let you through because fuck you, we don't care. Excuse my language. All right. So divestment is about targeting these corporations and asking the universities to do the opposite of investment, which is divestment. I just want the audience to understand that, right? The other thing I want people to understand is how for over a decade now, just like we did at my university locally here in USF and universities all across the country, they've been organizing over and over and over again through referendums, through student government resolutions, through petitions, right? Trying peacefully, I guess you could say, to get them to actually disinvest, and they won't do it. So to me, the reason why these university protests are so impactful and so powerful and so important is because it's escalated now. It's gone to the point where we played by the rules. You're not playing by your own rules. When you create a method for us, you say, oh, voice your opinion in student government. Like, it's your budget, it's your voice, it's your tuition, you guys have a say. But then when you actually exercise your right and you voice your opinion, the university says, actually, no, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about Israel. We're not going to divest. You're not allowed to talk about our investments. What else can you do beyond that? I think you can no longer play by the rules. And that's why these protests are so powerful in my eyes, because it's like, we have to do something to stop this genocide. We have to do something to stop your complicity, and we need to reverse your policies. And the way we're going to do that is by occupying the halls, by occupying pieces of grass on college campuses. So can you talk to us about that escalation and how you're seeing it spread across the country, and potentially how it can stop or at least put a dent in Israel's genocide?
Well, first, when it comes to divestment, I think what's really cool about these campus uprisings, you could say, is that a lot of these students before that are now like locking shields with cops didn't really even know about what divestment was. They didn't know that their universities were essentially like hedge funds that had vested interests in this genocide continuing. Like, yeah, you not only are they invested in Israeli tech and spyware that's eventually going to boomerang back on us, but Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, those are lucrative investments that, as organisms of financial capital, that you should invest in if you want return on profits in your endowment. So they were just learning about this, and that's how they got turned on to the issue, because there was like, oh, wow, we can actually do something about this. We can actually make some sort of change in this effort.
The point I was trying to make is that there was a need for the escalation, because the avenue that they claim that is the appropriate avenue, like a lot of conservatives, for example, seeing this on, they're like, why are these guys just suddenly, occupying college campuses? Why are they suddenly protesting and demonstrating, trying to force them? It's like, because they've exhausted every other option. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, so they've learned about divestment. They went through the proper channels. They organized through student groups. And then the double standards and hypocrisy started to happen. So I live in Texas. I live like 15 minutes away from UT campus, University of Texas, if you're not familiar. It experienced one of the more violent suppressions a couple weeks ago. Wednesday, they brought in hundreds of state troopers in riot gear. They brought in horses. They literally brought in the cavalry, because it's Texas and we still have cops on horses. So a horse trampled a Jewish student who was protesting. Both his parents were Israeli, so not the best look. They were throwing CNN cameramen to the ground. It got pretty intense, macing people, throwing flashbangs and stuff. And a lot of people were pissed off by the hypocrisy, right? Because a couple years ago, Greg Abbott, our governor, signed a bill ensuring free speech and freedom of expression on campus. And he was the one that called in the goon squads when they didn't even try to set up an encampment in UT. They just did a walkout protest, and they were going to occupy, just stand there, not even stay overnight, on the South Lawn in UT. And they called in an absurd amount of cops and state troopers, and it was insane. They weren't even trespassing. It's a public campus. And it turns out a lot of people are realizing that you can only say and exercise your right to free speech when you're spewing some racist ass bullshit, like against marginalized groups. But the second you criticize Israel, you no longer have freedom of speech. Because honestly, Greg Abbott, that's why he signed that bill, to literally defend white supremacist speech. So the amount of hypocrisy kids are starting to see, students, they're starting to witness state violence for the first time, and they're starting to understand it, and they're starting to understand how this is only going to get worse. We're seeing a future militarization of the police, and a lot of people are being called into action because it's like their future. So a lot of people are trying to discredit these kids. It's like they don't know what they're talking about. You know, they don't have any life experience. It's like, yeah, but if you look at it, when have students not been on the right side of history? And the amount of patronizing that's going on is kind of absurd, and it doesn't really matter what these people think, because student movements are always significant because they're the future. You're going out, they're coming in. And I think this is the most political generation I've seen. And they're starting to understand concepts that just like not even people who studied these things, like state violence, about how what happens in Israel is going to come back to haunt us as well. It's not just about divestment anymore. It's about, wow, these cops train in Israel and they're coming back. They're using Israeli spyware on us. And that's why we have to use Signal and organize like away from our phones, because something called the imperial boomerang. So it's not just about divestment. It's about, they're literally fighting for their future. And, you know, all of these conservatives who with don't tread on me flags are like, these are freaking liberals, leftist, crazy snowflakes. It's like, no, they're literally fighting for your freedoms, but you don't see it. So it's not just about divestment. It's also about what's happening here in America, because what happens in the colonies always comes back on us.
So let's talk about the imperial boomerang. You just alluded to what it was, but could you explain for our audience what that is?
So the imperial boomerang is a sociological thesis. I don't like calling it a thesis because I believe it's demonstrably true. I think it, but that's just an opinion. So we'll say it's a thesis. It's that forms of repression that are exercised by empire in its territories, i.e. its colonies, will eventually come back to be used on its own civilians, or citizens, excuse me. So, in other words, forms of colonial coercion will, through a process of imperial feedback, be used on us. So what happens in Israel will happen to us. So how I like to explain this is talk about the origin of modern policing. So basically, what happened before modern police? There was something throughout Europe called a constable and watch system. You know, you'd have a constable. He was an elected official. Sometimes he was elected. Sometimes he was appointed. The constable and watch system has existed since like the beginning of human society in different various guises. But essentially, you have a constable. He's in charge of executing warrants, recovering stolen goods, investigating crimes, and then you'd have watchmen. Volunteers sometimes they're important, appointed, and they would help the constable. It's kind of like a volunteer fighter, but for odd jobs, like, you know, a handyman in terms of like law enforcement. But the thing about constable and watch systems, they had no coercive force. So if there was like a workers' strike or a riot happening for whatever reason, they'd call in the army. And that was never a great solution because things got violent. It was bad in the press. It made people feel uncomfortable to have a bunch of muskets like firing into crowds. So eventually, they wanted a middle ground between the violence and the militarism of the army being called in to quell unrest, and the constable and watch system, which had no coercive force. So the idea of modern police became desirable. So in 1829, this guy named Sir Peel was appointed to create the London Metropolitan Police. This is our first example of what modern policing looks like. So he was an official in Northern Ireland. He had experience with the Dublin police. If you're not tracking, Northern Ireland was a colonized land in the British Empire. The Dublin police were kind of like the prototype for modern police, but they were also a counterinsurgency force against like the IRA and or proto-IRA and other insurgent forces in Northern Ireland resisting British occupation. So they would quell uprisings and fight crime. But in every colonial project, there is never a good definition or defining line between what is crime and what is an uprising. They bleed together. So this Peel guy, he also founded the Royal Irish Constabulary, which was a rural counterinsurgency force. They carried carbines, they slept in barracks, they patrolled precincts, and they had military ranks. It was built off a military rank structure, so you had sergeants, you had lieutenants, you had captains, which we see in the modern-day police force. And they patrolled precincts, designated areas of enforcement. So when he went to found the UK Metropolitan Police, he brought officers from the Army, from the Royal Irish Constabulary. He implemented systems that worked as a counterinsurgent force in Northern Ireland, and he overlaid them onto a civic police force in the London Metropolitan Police. And the UK police served as a model for police forces in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and other places throughout the Americas and later into Central Europe. So they were militarized from the start. They had military ranks. Of course, they haven't reached our level of militarization, but to say that the police are just becoming militarized is completely a mischaracterization of their origin. They also have traced their roots, especially American police, back to slave patrols in the Caribbean and the Carolinas. So the slave patrols were another Anglo counterinsurgency force. They'd search through slave quarters, look for weapons, sniff out any sort of like uprisings that were supposed to happen. In fact, slave patrol badges look like sheriff's badges still, hundreds of years later. So there's that as well. And so our police, the roots predict the outcome, right? So when we say that the police have been on the wrong side of also every labor struggle, they exist to quell uprisings. And that's why they've been on the wrong side of every labor struggle in history. They protect property. They protect slaves. They defend slaves, which are property. They defend the property of the factory owner, the factory. So they have the roots in protecting property because in the colonies, they are the ones that protected the embassies. They were the ones that protected the producers of capital and production and agriculture that were stripped out of the colony and sent back to the empire's heartland. So property protection, union busting, scab defense, which is the protecting of non-striking workers from striking workers, literally been on the wrong side of every struggle. They were enforcing crackdowns during women's suffrage, civil rights, Vietnam, Iraq War, name it, because they exist, again, as a counterinsurgency force. Mass protests that you can construe as violent look like uprisings. So
the idea is that instead of serving and protecting the community from crime, they are militarized actually to serve and protect power structures and wealth, and viewing the community they supposedly serve as potential revolters taking part in an uprising.
Yeah, and they frame it as like quelling civic unrest, restoring public order for everybody's safety. And I'm not saying that police don't solve crime. But when you look at trends and how it's activated during protests and people asking for progress and fighting for civil liberties, they take on that role 100%. So these forms of, when we talk about the imperial boomerang, these forms of colonial coercion, of property protection, of counterinsurgency, they come back through imperial feedback to be visited on us. So the biggest modern and most pertinent modern example of the imperial boomerang is our cops going over to our colonial project, Israel, learning how the Israeli Defense Force and Shin Bet and the Israeli police enforce occupation and apartheid in West Bank. They take those riot suppression techniques. They take, the whole like kneeling on someone's neck, which I forget who that killed. Was it George Floyd or Trayvon Martin?
Yeah,
or
George Floyd.
George Floyd. Yeah, that's an IDF move, by the way. They take the spyware, the domestic surveillance techniques used to enforce apartheid and occupation, and it's going to come back on us. It's already being used on us. Also, the cop city in Atlanta and lesser cop cities that are being built throughout the country, they're urban warfare training grounds, essentially, based off of what the IDF calls Little Gaza, which is a training compound in Israel. So this is a very stark example of what the imperial boomerang looks like in practice.
It's also interesting. I think Tom Cotton recently in a tweet.
One of my favorites.
Yeah, he called the encampments Little Gazas.
Yeah.
So just an interesting connection there. But yeah, you raise an interesting point. The police, I think, obviously they do solve crime. They do protect communities to a certain extent, but you don't need tanks to do that, right? So then when you see these protests and all of a sudden you see the police pull up in armored vehicles and they have these tanks and they all of a sudden they look like they really are there to quell an uprising, and they look like an occupation force. They no longer look like police. They look like an army.
Well, they're in military kit now.
Right.
They have assault rifles. Not only do they have assault rifles, but they're now better funded and have better tactical gear than the U.S. Army had back in like 2011. Like, I'm looking at all these cops, and they have Ops Corps helmets, which was like a type of helmet that's really comfortable. It's better designed than like a lot of the military helmets that you see in the movies. It has cutout for the ears, and it has a rail system. You can make it real fancy. But when I was in like 2013, the only people who had those helmets in the military were SEALs, Rangers, Green Berets, and Marine Force Reconnaissance. But now, like, every fat-ass cop has an Ops Corps helmet. And they're friggin' expensive, dude. They're like $1,000. I forget. I don't know what they are now, but they were really pricey. I'm like, why does
what are they up against to need that,
Well, the revolution. They're a counterinsurgency force. So they're getting progressively more militarized for a reason. All these cop cities really went into overdrive, the plans to create them after BLM, because people weren't expecting BLM to become what it was. Like, the amount of domestic resistance to police brutality, they weren't expecting that.
So we've been talking now for a good amount of time. I'd like to close with two things. One, I'd like you to give us your assessment for what you predict. I know it's very difficult, and you've talked about how we're in unprecedented territory, so it's very difficult to predict what happens next. Nonetheless, I'd like you to try and do so. So what happens next between Israel, Palestine, in Gaza? That, and also I'd like to hear from you what your advice is to the university students who may be listening, who intend to continue, whether it's the encampment or campus protests.
Okay, so first, with Gaza, again, a ceasefire has to happen eventually. I think this Rafah operation and now smaller operations that look like they're going to happen in the north and south and middle Gaza will push the timeline back for when that will eventually happen. But we know it has to happen eventually. So what's going to, I believe, after that, the next fight is going to be, because when the ceasefire happens, this ain't over. It's not even close, because what's going to happen is they're going to try to settle the north. They're going to try to bring people in. They're going to start it as like reconstruction attempts, but there's going to be settlers involved. And this is going to be a multi-year struggle. I think, depending on what happens in November, I don't think policy towards Israel will change. It might get worse under Trump, for all we know. Again, hard to make predictions. I think I was incorrect in some of mine. I thought a ceasefire would have happened in February because, sanity would have prevailed. But I guess people don't want to get reelected, and every decision Israel seems to be making is in its own worst long-term political interests. That being said, this is going to last a long time, and just look to what the Vietnam War looked like. The Vietnam backlash was unprecedented. It was massive. It was bigger than our pro-Palestine movement is now, and it lasted 10 years. 10 years. We're not even in year 1. We're in month 7. So just like strap in, because like once a ceasefire happens, it's going to be a bad faith ceasefire. Israel's going to try to engineer a way to blame a breaking of the ceasefire on Hamas. They're going to try to restart hostilities. They're going to try to settle. They're going to try to occupy. And this ain't going anywhere anytime soon.
Will Hamas ever surrender?
Why would they? They don't need to. They literally don't need to. They're literally winning.
Well, let's say this drags on 3 years.
I don't think they'd be defeated in 3 years. Not unless they literally kill everybody in Gaza, which they won't be able to do for a couple of reasons. First of all, they will be stopped. They will have to be stopped by our allies because we are losing too much influence in Africa, in the Middle East, to other actors that aren't conducting a visible genocide of non-white people. So other nations in the global south are going to be sympathetic to that on a very basic human level.
Okay, and then the campus protesters.
Campus protests.
The advice that you have for the campus protesters.
Well, the more numbers you have, the safer you're going to be. So I would say if you're planning an action and you have to delay it for a little bit, I mean, some actions happen and they have to be done then and there. If you can delay it to get like 100 more people, 50 more people, do it. That's the way to stay safe. Also, look into different strategies with how to confront cops. There's strategies on how to kettle them, which is like how to surround them so they have to withdraw. There are strategies on how to de-arrest people. So kettling and de-arresting is going to be very important going forward. De-arresting is where you also surround the cops and you essentially force them to let the detainees go so the cops can withdraw. Cops generally do not like being outnumbered. That's why when they pull you over because you're speeding, they call in like 3 squad cars, and there needs to be 6 of them now to issue a parking ticket. So they're like, you might be scared, but they are also scared too. So numbers, and also we need to start organizing better. So when you're planning actions, there's green, yellow, and red actions. Red actions are like actions you're going to take that you're going to get arrested. Yellow actions are actions that you might, and green are pretty much just sitting on the picket line. You're not going to anything's going to happen to you. But organizing and letting everybody know what this might be, getting on the same page with that. And a lot of these kids, based off what they're doing in college, like they already know this stuff. So I don't want to be like some geezer giving advice, but yeah, I think everyone's becoming really more sophisticated. We learned a lot about how to deal and engage with police and how to deal with them strategically through BLM, and it's only going to get more sophisticated. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. For my part, I'm trying to mobilize more veterans at these things because cops don't like it. And it also makes younger people feel safer when vets are around, just because, cops don't really know how to deal with us. So
yeah,
that's my struggle right now. Trying to motivate a bunch of guys who are just like, I did my time, man. I'm out now. I'm just trying to live my life. So that's kind of an uphill battle, but yeah, should be exciting over the next few months. And these things will ebb and flow. So it's going to die off a little, and then something's going to happen. It's going to kick back up. It's going to die off a little. It's going to kick back up. But awareness will steadily be raised and raised and raised. So it's going to take a long time.
I think you raised a very good point when you talked about how Vietnam protests went on for 10 years.
10 years.
So I think we need to have stamina. Mm-hmm. We need to have endurance. We need to have wisdom. And every opportunity we have, escalate. But, to the best of our abilities, not engage in violence. Be careful. Protect ourselves, because we don't want to get hurt, but also we don't want to give the other side the opportunity to say, look how violent and out of control these people are. So definitely good advice there. I love the advice about adding more numbers. I think that's incredibly important. One, it's good for imagery. When the media covers it, it doesn't look like just, a minority of people just getting beat up on by police because they've committed a crime, but rather it looks like a popular front or a popular uprising, I should say.
Yeah.
But yeah, you were going to say something.
Yeah, my last point was I think thinking about the Vietnam backlash, I think one of the things that hurt it the most was fragmentation. Like in leftist movements, we tend to fragment. Like everybody, like we don't organize and we don't toe the line as well as the fascists. So the different ideological differences over time can really hurt us. So just stick to the basics. Is genocide bad? Yeah. Or do we need to resist state violence and fight for our First Amendment rights? Yeah, but getting bogged down between like anarchists fighting Marxists fighting that is something that happened during Vietnam and it was actually really damaging.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
So don't fragment, guys. That's all.
And I think that's also what kind of happening within the Muslim community as well, because of Syria, there are people who were against the uprising in Syria and people who were for it, and there's a lot of debate there. They don't want to cooperate whatsoever. I understand online, but in person, I think try to stay focused on Palestine. It's not that these differences don't matter. They do, and if they're important to you, that's great. But remember, the focus is Palestine, the focus is Gaza, the focus is a ceasefire, the focus is ending this genocide and freeing Palestine. So, set your differences aside and work together and collaborate to the best of your abilities.
Absolutely.
Well, Mr. Stoker, it was a pleasure having you here. I hope to do this again one day, and I look forward to watching more of your podcast with Colonial Outcasts. You have your own YouTube channel, is that correct?
Yeah, we're also on Spotify, but we might have to divest to Spotify because they're invested in some problematic AI-driven weapon systems technology that we're still looking forward to. But we are on Apple Podcasts as well. So
okay,
yeah.
Excellent.
So thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to link, Colonial Outcast in the description. So if you'd like to see more of Mr. Stoker's content, then definitely click the link, check out his work, follow him on Instagram. I'm sure you already do. That's probably why you're watching our content. But if you've never seen his work, definitely check it out. I hope to do this again sometime. So thanks for being here.
Same here. Thank you.
All right, my brother.
All right.
I'm sorry if that took a little longer than expected.
No, I hope that was a good one. I'm still getting used to
Trust nothing. No law.